blood will go from high pressure to low pressure, right? And so that's this thing here. It has to be higher so that you can have the passive filling, right? And then you have your atrial contraction. So that was that A curve. So what kind of filling would that be?
Active.
Active filling, right? And what I purposely did here is, this is time, right, going across. Notice how the P wave is right before the atrial contraction, right? Because when you get the P wave, that's going to be the depolarization across the atria, okay? When you depolarize the atria, then the atria is like, okay, now I'm depolarized, I can then contract, okay? So the atria will contract, and then blood will move down into the ventricle, and you get a little bit of a bump of the ventricle. Why would that be?
Because it's filling up.
Because the pressure is going up due to the filling. Exactly, the active filling, right? Okay. So this part right here should be like the easiest part of it, right? There is a point here where everything is relaxed. You guys agree? Nothing is contracting. And that in the book it talks about something called diastasis, where there's no contraction of either the atria or the ventricle. All right, then you get this QRS complex. When we get the QRS complex, what's getting depolarized now?
Ventricles.
The ventricles, right? All those things that we listed, AV node, bundled His, all that stuff. That's going to cause the ventricles to depolarize. That's when you're going to get the contraction of the ventricles right there. So that's this blue curve going up, okay? And we'll talk about this with the quiz, but that will close the bicuspid valve, okay? Because you don't want blood going back where?
Into the atria.
Into the atria, right? So it's actually, the bicuspid valve is open through this entire period here because of the filling, right? It's just going to go from atria to ventricles, 80%, and then it eventually will close when the ventricles start to go increase their pressure. Because again, the valves are all about one-way flow. Everything was going from the atria to the ventricles. Blood would want to go back into the atria because the ventricular pressure is getting so high, but we don't want it to do that, so there's a perfectly placed valve between the atria and the ventricles, right? So we close that, and then the aortic semilunar valve isn't open yet, and so what is that window called? Isovolumetric contraction. So blood is not getting pushed out yet during this time period. The ventricles are isometric, so what does that mean? They're not getting shorter, blood is not getting ejected yet until we leave that window and we open that aortic semilunar valve, right? So you go from this, what's called isometric contraction to isotonic contraction. What happens during isotonic? The fibers can then shorten, right? And as they shorten, notice the pressure curves. Where's the blood going? From where to where?
From the ventricles.
From high to low, right? So from the ventricles into the green, what's the green?
The aorta.
The aorta, yep. So blood's going from the ventricle to the aorta, and it'll continue that way, okay? Eventually, the ventricles will be told to relax. That's going to be stimulated by the T wave, right? So again, think cause and effect. There's a little bit of a delay each time, right? P wave causes atrial contraction, QRS causes ventricular contraction, and then the T wave will stimulate the ventricles to relax. Does that make sense? Okay? So it will relax, 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 up to the point where, oh my gosh, it's actually going to go below that of the aortic pressure. Why would the aorta have much higher pressure than the ventricles at this point?
That's where the blood's going, right?
It's filled with blood. The aorta is filled with blood. You just pushed so much blood into the aorta. Now the pressure is going to be higher than that of the ventricles. How do you keep the blood from spilling back into the ventricles? The ASLV will close, okay? So you got to think about it in terms of just flow, right? It's all like movement from one section of your cardiovascular to another section. Atria to ventricles, that's movement from one area to another. Ventricles into the aorta, and there's these little locks, right, or valves that open to allow that series to continue in a one-way direction, you know. All right, then that will relax eventually to the point where we go below that of atrial pressure, and this could slope up a little bit more. That's okay. And that's when the bicuspid valve will open, right? Because what are these different little sloping up areas? What would this be, this upslope right here?
Increase of pressure, increase of blood. And
So that, what's that curve called? Remember the F curve, right?
It fills.
So,
Did I do the F curve with you?
Yeah.
What does F stand for?
It fills.
Fills, right?
Fills the-
Okay, so that's the filling of the atria. You're like, why is pressure building in the atria? I thought, because blood is filling it, right? And it eventually will crash down, because where is that blood going now? Into the ventricles. You're back to passive filling. Right? So it's almost like, oh my gosh, the atria was this closed chamber until the bicuspid valve opened. Well, why did the bicuspid valve open? Well, because the pressure is now lower in the ventricles, right? The bicuspid valve is a one-way door. When the ventricular pressure is higher, it is closed, okay? When the ventricular pressure drops below the atrial pressure, it can now open, and you can have passive filling, okay? So there's the F there, there's also the C there, right? And so that really accounts for the three curves on the atrial pressure. All right. So let's tie this into some of the quiz questions.